Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Nandini, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for this year. Conflict among our goals are a major impediment to living a good life. Conflicts frustrate competing goals, and they also cause us to wonder if we're on the wrong path. As college students, we often face many conflicts. We think to ourselves, should I go out tonight if I have an assignment due tomorrow? Should I visit my grandparents this weekend or attend an academic conference? Conflicts are natural and inevitable. How we address those conflicts define who we are as people. Professor Valerie Tiberius will present a constructive way of thinking about goal conflicts and how to resolve them. Valerie Tiberius is the Paul W. Frenzel Chair in Liberal Arts and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota. Her work explores the ways in which philosophy and psychology can both contribute to the study of well-being and virtue. She is the author of The Reflective Life, Living Wisely with Our Limits, Moral Psychology, A Contemporary Introduction, and Well-Being as Value Fulfillment, How We Can Help Others to Live Well. Much of Professor Tiberius's work has taken a practical, empirical approach to philosophical questions, trying to show how these disciplines can improve the world for the better. Professor Tiberius's Athenaeum Talk is one part of a three-part series on interdisciplinary perspectives on happiness, co-sponsored by the Berger Institute for Individual and Social Development and the Gold Center for Humanistic Studies, both at CMC. Professor Tiberius will present for about 40 minutes before jumping into conversation with me and Chris. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tiberius to the Athenaeum.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I can just tell you right off the bat, as a professor, I say stay in and study and don't go out. That's my answer to that question that you posed. I'm really happy to be here with you today, or I should say not physically there with you, but there in spirit. I'm actually in Minnesota at the moment, land of 10,000 lakes, most of them frozen for far too much of the year. And I'm very excited to be talking to you about some work that I've been doing on well-being and goal conflict, which is the basis for a book that I'm working on now. It will be my COVID project. That book is this title that you're seeing here is not the title of that book. I'm terrible with titles, and so my editor is going to be helping me with the title of this new book. I want to start with the ancients and to go back to a time when philosophers roamed the earth talking about such things as beauty, truth, and justice. And it's, in fact, justice I want to focus on to start with. In particular, I want to go back to Socrates and Glaucon and a conversation that they had about whether justice is in a person's self-interest. That's what Socrates thought. So in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, Socrates claims that justice is good for the person who is just. And essentially what he meant by justice was just doing the right thing, treating other people in accordance with the rules of morality, being a good and fair person. So Socrates thought that being just, if you're moral and you do right by other people, that's also good for you. But Glaucon issues a challenge to this idea in the form of a thought experiment. So the thought experiment is called the Ring of Gyges, and the Ring of Gyges, if you put it on, turns you invisible. It's some of you might be thinking about Tolkien's One Ring to Rule Them All. It's a little bit like that ring, although there's no suggestion that it corrupts your soul by the power of a Sauron or something like that. So here you let's say you run across this ring and it makes you invisible. Let's imagine too that it makes whatever you're carrying or wearing also invisible. My students always want to know, would my clothes give me away? Glaucon thought that if we had a ring like this, what we would do is we would in fact be completely corrupted. We would become absolutely immoral. And so Glaucon, in the dialogue, he protests to Socrates. He says, no man who had this ring would keep his hands off what was not his own, or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, kill or release from prison whom he would. So Glaucon basically thinks if we had a ring that made us invisible, and therefore we could get away with doing all these immoral things, that is precisely what we would do. So that's Glaucon's challenge. And what you learn from this challenge, and in fact, the impression you get from the history of moral philosophy, where this challenge has figured very centrally, is that this conflict between doing what's right and doing what's good for me is the central conflict of human life. And of course, it is an important conflict, and it is true that there are, a fortunately small minority of people who, when they are given anonymity, as on the internet, they become moral monsters. But if you think about your own life, you could ask yourself, is this conflict between morality and self-interest the most important conflict for you? So you could start to think about that question in this way. What would you do with the ring, and would it help you very much? If you're like my students, you'll probably be thinking of some fun things you would do with the ring when you first ran across it. So most of my students say they would get on a plane to an expensive destination like New Zealand or Fiji. Then, of course, there's always a conversation about where they would sit on the plane, and most of them end up locked in a bathroom. But still, they think that would be a fun thing to do with the ring. Some students, another popular answer is, some say they'd like to listen secretly to what other people were saying about them. But they usually think better of that fairly quickly and think, actually, that's maybe not such a great thing to do. So after these couple of fun things you can think of to do, what else would this invisibility ring do for you? Glaucon thinks it would change our lives completely and solve our major conflict. But let's think about, for most of us, for yourself and your friends and your loved ones, what are your major challenges in life, the major conflicts in your life? Well, I can't see you, and even if I could, I don't know you well enough to ask you what your major life conflicts are, but I can tell you about some of mine in broad outline. I have had type 1 diabetes since I was 2 years old, and I have a rather constant conflict between managing my chronic illness and trying to live a relatively normal life and not become a very neurotic and unfun person who doesn't do anything. Of course, I have, as does almost everyone these days, conflicts between work and life, the so-called work-life balance. And for me, that takes, one of the main forms that takes is thinking about, how do I divide my time between spending it with family and friends versus my job responsibilities? I also think, especially recently, when, and in my city of Minneapolis, when questions of racial injustice have been so forefront in people's minds, I have a real desire to do something that contributes to making the world a better, less racist, more wonderful place. And of course, that desire has to be balanced with the requirements of my fairly demanding job. So I bet that there's something in here that other people can relate to. Of course, we don't all have the same kinds of families. We don't have the same health problems. We probably don't agree about what it would take to make the world a better place, but we all have similar goals, and we all have conflicts among those goals. So we can ask, would being invisible help? Well, it wouldn't help me at all if I were invisible. I would still be diabetic. I'd still be an anxious person. I'd still have family I love who live all over the country. I'd still have a demanding job. I'd still have a desire to contribute meaningfully to making the world a better place. And all of these things would still be competing for my limited time and energy. So I think that life is not so much like this as it is like this. What's right about the story of the Ring of Gyges is that we have different goals and that goal conflict is a major problem for us. It's just that our goals for most people, again, don't neatly divide into these two buckets, the moral and the self-interested. Our conflicts are a lot more complicated. But I do think the idea that goals and goal conflict are crucial is a really important idea. And in fact, we might think it even constitutes a view about human nature, that human beings are fundamentally goal-seeking creatures with multiple competing goals. So if that's what human beings are like, what is good for us? What's good for goal-fulfilling, goal-seeking creatures? Well, fulfilling the goals that are most important to us over the long term is what's good for us. And what's bad for us is not being able to fulfill those important goals. And goal conflict is a major cause of that inability. So that's the basic framework that I'm starting with here. Fulfillment is good, conflict is bad. Because we are goal seekers, when we're unhappy or unfulfilled or stressed or frustrated, we can usually find some conflict that's causing this. That's what that's sort of suggested by the idea that this is a view about human nature. When things are going badly, you can look and find that there's a conflict at the bottom of it somewhere. Okay, so if conflict is a problem, what can we do about it? Well, here are 3 basic responses to goal conflict. And I realize that first number is a typo. This shouldn't be, it should just say 1, not 1.1. Sorry about that. So first, you can refine or reinterpret the goal. Second, give up one of the goals, just abandon it if it's conflicting with other things. Or third, keep both the goals you have as they are, but think about how to prioritize them and what means you can take to achieving them. So I want to illustrate these strategies with a really kind of a silly example, and then I'm going to move on to more real life complex examples. So the silly example is this. Let's say your goal is to buy the perfect new pair of shoes for a wedding. This is a goal I have had in the past. And typically what I want when I am looking for shoes to wear to a wedding, I want not to spend too much money. I want them to be comfortable enough not to hurt my feet when I'm standing or dancing. And I want them to look nice. Those are typically the goals within the goal of buying these shoes. Must be the pandemic that has me wishfully thinking about going to a wedding. I think that's what's happening here. So the first strategy, refining or reinterpreting the goal, you might think to yourself, I might think to myself, I don't really want new shoes. What I really want is to be able to dance and look respectable. And I can do this with shoes that I already have in my very own closet. this is not actually my closet. You don't want to see my closet. This is a closet from the internet. So it could be that buying a new pair of shoes was not really quite my goal in the first place. And I can reinterpret that goal to mean having an appropriate pair of shoes. And then I discover that I don't actually have to buy it. But perhaps because I live in Minnesota, my closet looks more like this. And so I can't reinterpret the goal in that way. And maybe what I'll consider is the second strategy of giving up one of the conflicting goals. And one thing I could do is I could say, comfort is everything. I care about my feet, forget price, forget looks. And perhaps I would end up with this shoe. Now, just looking at this shoe makes me sad. And so I might say to myself, you know, I just can't give up the goal of looking sort of nice with the dress that I have. So I'm going to not take this strategy and instead start to think about this third strategy, keeping all my sub goals, but thinking about how to prioritize them. And perhaps I say to myself, okay, it's an absolute priority that I will not spend more than a certain amount of money. I want them to be at least not ugly and not too uncomfortable. So then I might think about the means to these goals that I have and I'm not willing to give up. And one means I might think of is, well, don't shop at the most expensive shoe stores if price is really important to you. And maybe I'll end up with something like this. Okay, so that's a silly example. Shopping involves very simple goals. What about complex conflicts? Conflicts where you have multifaceted goals that are ultimate goals, conflicts in which you're not even really totally sure what your goal is, and conflicts with goals that are actually not fully brought to your consciousness. So to see how things get more complicated, you can think about the so-called work-life balance problem. Work and life are definitely multifaceted goals. If you think about the goals, your goal of being successful in your career or the goals you have with respect to your job, there are many things that fall into that set. You typically want to get along with your coworkers. You want to make your boss happy. You want to achieve certain things. If you're a doctor, you want to cure patients. If you're a teacher, you want to teach students. If you make a product, you want that product to be reliable and high quality. Similarly, for life, there are so many aspects to what counts as life. Our family, our friends, church, music, sports, leisure activities in general, traveling, all kinds of different things. So the work-life balance label makes it sound like it could be a simple conflict, but in fact, it's very much more complicated. Just talking about work-life balance is very abstract, and I'm going to need to introduce some specific examples to work with and make some progress. I want to start with an example of a case study of a hypothetical philosophy professor. Not that hypothetical, it's actually me. So I was raised in Canada, so I'm culturally polite. I was also, as I mentioned before, basically raised with a chronic illness, type 1 diabetes. And I don't know if this is true for other people with diabetes, but I had doctors who didn't have the best bedside manner or social skills. And so really, I think at a very young age made me feel like if I don't please other people and do exactly what other people ask me to do all the time, I will end up dead. Maybe blind, maybe without toes, but eventually dead. So that kind of personality, sort of a polite pleaser personality, is okay as far as it goes. But I also ended up being very interested in philosophy, which is has been, certainly was when I entered the field, a very male-dominated field, a very aggressive, assertive field, where you succeed by holding your ground. And it's very hard to be successful without risking making people unhappy. Philosophy is very argumentative. So we'll come back to this. That's conflict number one. Here's the second case study. Think about a male nurse who was raised in a culture that valorizes traditional conceptions of masculinity. So this example comes from some research I was reading about men in caring professions and the tendency of men in caring professions to pursue stereotypically masculine hobbies like weightlifting or boxing. So we could imagine that for this nurse, male nurse raised in a certain way, there's a kind of conflict between what he was taught about what it means to be a man and the career that he's chosen. So what are the goals in these two case studies? Well, in my case, or case of the philosopher, be polite and make everybody happy, please everybody, and be a successful philosopher. In the male nurse's case, be manly, where that means something pretty specific to him, and be a great nurse. Just a couple of notes about these things. First, these first two goals might not be conscious pursuits. In fact, be polite and please everybody it's never a goal that I would, if someone asked you, what are your goals in life? I would never say, well, I want to be polite and please everybody. It's more of an unconscious motivation that's at work. Similarly, for the nurse, it might be that he doesn't think about being manly as a goal. It's an unconscious goal. That could be the case. Second, notice that these goals don't necessarily produce a conflict. It might be that either the philosopher or the nurse has, found a way that these things fit perfectly well together, and so there isn't a conflict. I just want to talk about cases in which they do present a conflict for the person, and I can tell you they certainly have for me. So heading back to our conflict reduction strategies, what these strategies require is that we identify our ultimate goals. So in order to use these strategies for our more complicated cases, we have to be able to figure out what the ultimate goals are. Not just the things we want for the sake of something else, but the ultimate goals. And to do that, I'm going to introduce a new concept, which is the concept of values. People use the word values in a million different ways, but what I mean by them is basically to value something is to have a relatively stable pattern of attitudes towards it. So values are a special kind of goal that bring together the different aspects of our personality. So for example, if you value a friendship, you want to spend time with your friend. You feel feelings of joy when you're together. And you also think or believe or judge that friendship is good for you, and you make room for it in your planning. Now, for most people, values include things. There's a lot of commonality about what human beings have as their ultimate values. And typical human beings value things like satisfying work and friendship, family, some kind of spiritual connection, art, health, pleasure, autonomy, respect. Those are on the list of many people's basic values. Okay, so now back to our strategies. If we think about these conflicting goals, we can ask, what are the ultimate values at stake in the conflict? When it comes to the goal of being polite and pleasing everyone, is the ultimate value something like deference or meekness? Or is the ultimate value something like kindness and compassion? When it comes to being a successful philosopher, is the ultimate value being in a boys' club or having a certain reputation? Or is it more making a good contribution to a worthwhile profession? What are the things that really matter to me emotionally and reflectively about these goals? That's what we're asking. Similarly, for the nurse, being manly, is that about having power over other people and being invulnerable? Or is it about strength and courage? Is being a great nurse, is what he really cares about in nursing, emulating the model nurses who trained him? Or is it making a valuable contribution in his own way? I think that how you see the ultimate values that are at stake in your goals and in your goal conflicts really affects how the strategies will go. So strategy one, this is likely the most important strategy when it comes to complex conflicts and multifaceted goals, and especially with unconscious goals that have to be discovered or uncovered first. So we might think, once we've identified the goals, could I change how I think about success in philosophy so that it's not about reputation and being part of an in-group or a club? Could I see the intellectual value of working on topics that women tend to care more about, and therefore topics that in a male-dominated field don't get as much attention but are nevertheless important? Can the male nurse change how he thinks about manliness? Could he think that doing a non-traditionally male job is a kind of courage? When we think about our values, we may recognize that we do actually value some things that are major sources of conflict. So it can be reasonable to look at another strategy. So one thing that might happen when you start thinking about your ultimate values is you realize, hey, my ultimate values actually don't conflict, because if manliness is courage, and courage can include taking on a non-traditional job, then being manly and being a male nurse are not in conflict anymore. But it might be that even when you think about the ultimate values, you realize there is still some conflict there. And that brings us to the second strategy, which is to give up one of the conflicting goals. So in general, there are some goals that just aren't good for us. And these might even be special goals that count as values. Philosophers and psychologists have been arguing philosophers for millennia, that being rich and famous and powerful, that these are not good goals for us to have. Certainly being perfect or making everybody like us, these are not great goals to have. And that's partly because success in these goals depends too much on other people. They're very relative. We're also not even happy with these things when we get them. So these are goals that are good candidates for giving up. Similarly, I think if we learn that our goal is to be deferential or meek, or to wield power over other people, or to be emotionally invulnerable, those are good goals to consider giving up if we can. It's easier said than done, but it would be a good strategy, and it's not impossible. The third strategy is the prioritization and adjustment. So once we have a clearer sense of our values and of what we can get rid of, we can think about how to pursue the values that we have in a better, more effective way. And at this point, things really get too specific for me to be able to say much, but we can notice that when we recognize what really matters, new paths open up. For example, if I were to recognize that doing philosophy in a different way from what's the norm in a very male field is a valuable way to do it, I might recognize that I, as a means to this end of being a successful philosopher, newly defined, I would do well to surround myself with other women philosophers who can support me in that. And it might be that for the male nurse, taking on a hobby that his male relatives would see as manly would be a good way for him to reduce the conflict that he experiences. If that hobby is healthy and he enjoys it, that could be a reasonable strategy. So summing up, we have goal conflict producing stress and unhappiness, these strategies for goal resolution, which brings a clearer sense of ultimate values and how to fulfill them. And I think that what this brings us to is essentially a theory of what it is to live well, what I call value fulfillment theory. And that theory says that what's good for us is the fulfillment of our values over time. That given the complexity of our values and the potential for conflict, we should aim to fulfill the values that fit us, the ones that resonate emotionally and reflectively, and the ones that we can actually fulfill. Now, this theory raises a lot of questions, and I hope I'll hear some of them after the talk, but in the remaining minutes, I want to consider one of those questions, which is, how do we know if we have the right values? And you might be thinking, shouldn't philosophy tell us what the values are and not just give us this method for resolving conflicts? So I guess what I want to say about this is, first of all, if I told you what the values are that you should have, I don't think you would believe me, because we have to start with what we have. We start where we are, and build from there. It's a kind of a constructive process. But when it comes to ultimate values, it's not the case that anything goes. So the real worry here about getting it wrong might be that if there's no sort of anchor or foundation for what the right values are, then you could really just be radically wrong. You could just get it all completely incorrect. I don't think that's such a reasonable thing to worry about, because I think that even if no one can tell you what is ultimately valuable and how to resolve any conflict you have, the process is not completely open-ended. When we identify our ultimate values and resolve conflicts among our goals, we're not just flailing around in radical freedom. And that is because our human nature guides us. It's a constraint. There are certain very general ultimate values that have evolved in human beings, and almost every person not every person, but most people have these values. They might prioritize them in different ways, but most people value autonomy, competence, novelty, stability, and affiliation. I want to focus on affiliation to bring us back to where we started. So what I want to say about affiliation, these are goals that have to do with relationships with other people, or pro-social goals. These goals are profoundly intertwined with work and life. So in your work goals, you're most likely to want to have good relationships with your coworkers, to have goals that have to do with training other people, mentoring other people, being trained yourself, learning from other people, new skills. The purpose of your work is very likely to have a pro-social or affiliative dimension. You know, if you're like me, if you're a teacher, you have to teach students. If you're in the healthcare profession, of course, you're helping other people with their health. If you're a musician, you play for an audience. So if you work for a company that makes a product, you need people to buy that product, and you want the product to be useful to them. On the life side, it's even more obvious that affiliative or pro-social goals are wrapped up with our own personal life goals, because here some of our goals just are having good relationships with other people, with our friends and families. But other people are also deeply connected to our leisure activities, to team sports and playing in bands and going on vacation and taking tours from people who know about the place that you're visiting. So many of the things we do and care about involve other people profoundly. You can certainly see that in our case studies as well. I value being nice to people. I've tried to train myself out of caring about about making everybody happy, but I do care about being nice to people, and I care about contributing to a shared human project. The nurse cares about helping other people through his job, and he also cares about how other people see him. So the point here is that our goals don't neatly divide into self-regarding goals and other-regarding goals. And that's, I think, one reason that the ring of Gyges, the invisibility ring, wouldn't help us very much. We care about other people for their own sakes. They're already there in so many of our goals. So how do we know if we have the right values? That was the question about this value fulfillment theory that I started with right at the end of the talk. Well, there are no guarantees in life, but if your ultimate values are not in conflict, if they fit your whole self, your emotions and your desires and your judgments, they suit your human nature, you're, I think, on a very good track. So what I've tried to talk about today is this idea, my theory of a prudentially good life, or of well-being, which is that it consists in fulfilling the ultimate values that fit you in your life and that fit together. If that's your view about what a good life is, goal conflicts are a serious problem. We can address conflicts in several different ways, by choosing to give up one of the goals, by figuring out different ways to pursue our goals, or by identifying and reinterpreting the real values that are at stake in these conflicts. And then finally, because we're human beings, the process of refining our values is informed by our human nature, which is profoundly social. So we don't choose our values in a vacuum, and we also don't choose them alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that wonderful presentation. I want to encourage the audience to send in some questions in the Q&A function, and we're going to start off with a question from a student asking, you kind of talked a little bit about like your values should not conflict with your other values that you hold, but what if your individual goals or values conflict with communal goals or values? So what if two people's goals are conflicting with each other?
That's a great question, and it has a lot of different dimensions. So maybe like well, it isn't that simple, but one way of thinking about that question is conflict between two people, which of course you have in friendships and marriages and family relationships. You could also have a conflict between the individual and the community, which is a larger community. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that many of the conflicts that are the most troubling for us as individuals are conflicts that where we can't neatly divide us versus them. So if you think about a conflict between a person and her community, it's sort of easy to say that you have, it's me against the world, and I want this, and my community doesn't want it. But what's often true, if you look at it, is that this one person is part of a sub-community, a smaller group, maybe a smaller group of people who want the larger community to change. They could have all sorts of different kinds of reasons for wanting the larger community to change. They could be moral reasons. So there isn't going to, I don't have a neat answer for how you resolve that type of conflict, but I do want to suggest that it's not profoundly different from the kinds of conflicts I've been talking about. So a group of people could use these same sorts of processes to resolve conflicts among them. You could try to identify what are the values that we all agree on as a community. What are our basic values as a group? What are our basic values as a romantic partnership or as a family? And how are we representing those values in our lives? So it's a very huge question, and I gave it a try.
Next question asks, with infinite time and energy, we could accomplish all our goals with room to spare, but in real life, these constraints are very real, so we revert to prioritizing our own goals. And this comes down to employing our personal value judgments pretty much every time. Do you agree with this idea of thinking or way of thinking?
I definitely agree that we don't have unlimited time. I was just, let's say, reading something about immortality, whether it would actually be good to be immortal or not. The short answer to the question is yes. I absolutely agree with the person who asked the question that that limited time is one of the most crucial constraints, for sure. What I wonder, and I think what that question opens up for us to think about, is what would it be like to live a life in which you have no limitations of time, which you knew you were going to live forever? It's fascinating to think about that. You might think it would be super boring ultimately, because you would have done everything. Or, maybe it would be wonderful. I don't know. But yes, I do agree with the questioner for sure.
You mentioned that human nature serves as a constraint when we're kind of forming our values and pursuing our goals. What other constraints do you think play a role into these goal formation, value formation theories? Do institutions play a role? And if so, how?
Great. So, for one thing, individual nature is another constraint. So we can change our personality. You can shift your personality traits a little bit, but you are, to a large extent, you are who you are, and you have to make choices within the constraints of the psychological person, yourself, your psychological self. That is actually a constraint. Your physical capacities are also a constraint. I could never be a professional basketball player. I'm not tall enough and I have no hand-eye coordination. That's a physical limitation. Institutions absolutely constrain what we're able to do. And they not only do institutions prevent us from fulfilling our goals sometimes, but they can shape the very goals that we have. And that's actually a very important question in the literature on well-being. The question is about how gender and racial oppression sometimes distort people's sense of what matters in life in ways that serve other people, not the agent, him or herself. And I think when institutions and social forces have those kinds of distorting effects on people, it's all the more important to enable people to think about how those forces are frustrating part of your nature, if that makes sense.
The conflict resolution strategies outlined emphasize individualistic solutions. However, some goal conflict resolutions seem best brought about by institutional changes rather than personal changes. Someone's work-life balance conflicts might be exacerbated by lack of access to paid parental leave, and so institutional changes allowing access to leave would be a highly effective resolution to these conflicts. How do these institutional strategies fit into the overall framework?
That's a great question, and it kind of fits in with the previous question. Terrific. So my work recently has been about very much focused on an individual perspective and how one person goes about living his or her life. I absolutely think it's true that societies and communities can be arranged in better or worse ways for value fulfillment. So I happen to think that oppressive arrangements where one group of people, because of their sex or gender or race or religion, are constrained in ways that serve another group of people, those are bad arrangements for people's well-being, because they close off options for people to even recognize what their deepest values are. And once recognized, they close off options for people to fulfill those values. So from my point of view, where I'm thinking about individual choices, the way I would want to work that point in is to say, individual people who care about other people and about making the world a just place should absolutely care about institutional change. If you want to help other people and improve their lives, being a therapist is one way. That's very individual, but trying to reduce injustices and create opportunities for people to pursue the values that all human beings have, that's a much better way to do it. Or, well, I shouldn't say it's better. It's good. Being therapists are great and important. So I don't mean to say one is better than the other, but it's an equally important way to try to improve people's lives. I've just been more focused on the individual case.
You spoke a little bit about justice and injustice right now, and I'm curious to know how we can create this more just world if conceptions of justice differ on an international scale.
Wow, that question is beyond my pay grade, and it's a great question. It really is not my expertise to talk about how to effectively procure political change. I really wish I knew the answer to that question, because then I would probably do that. But I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, I guess what from the point of view of my own research, what I could contribute to that question is, if you think that what's important, what's human fulfillment for individual people has to do with setting and pursuing values, to do things that you care about and that you find meaningful, it does tell you some things about what a just society ought to provide for people. And many of the things that I think are recommended by my perspective on well-being are not terribly surprising. People need to have their basic needs met, because you can't have these thoughts about your ultimate values, and you can't start to think about the things you care most about in life if what you're worried about is feeding your children. People also need a kind of freedom from stress and anxiety that we certainly don't have in American society. That we don't have, there isn't a lot of it in the world, that kind of freedom. But it's very hard to be a person who can think the kinds of things that I'm talking about if you're worrying about your childcare falling through and losing your job, and if you're worried about not having health care and having your bank account wiped out because you have to pay to fix your son's broken arm or whatever. So I guess that's really a point also about basic needs, but it's a point that basic needs are not just food. It's basic needs, and it would, for me, include the things that would provide people with enough leisure and freedom of mind to be able to do things that they care about and that they find meaningful.
How does your framework accommodate people who don't really understand their own goals, or maybe they misidentify their goals?
So I think there are people who, the quick answer is I think pretty well, because, an implication of the theory is that if you misidentify your goals and pursue something that conflicts with the goals that you have in a sort of deep emotional way, you're going to be unhappy. And in fact, I think that is true. I think people who misidentify their goals and pursue things they don't care about, they are unhappy, and they don't get a lot of value fulfillment either. I think there are things that can help people who maybe have trouble. Not everybody likes to just sit around reflecting on what their values are. That's kind of a weird thing to do, but there are things, you don't have to be a sort of super reflective person to engage in this kind of thinking about values. One of the things I think is really important is paying attention to your emotional responses to things. So for instance, I think boredom is a huge signal. Unless it's different if you're like in exam crunch time and you're spending too much time studying, you might experience some boredom and it doesn't mean much. But if you're pursuing a line of, a career path or a hobby or a relationship, and you find yourself consistently bored, that is telling you something about what your goals are at an emotional level. And I think listening to those feelings is really important, and you don't have to be a very reflective person to think that.
Thank you so much. Before we close, do you have any parting thoughts for our audience?
Oh, I wish I had parting thoughts, but the questions were so awesome and wide-ranging that now I just want to go and write some things down and not forget what you all talked about. It was really terrific.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Professor Tiberius and to all of those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our very last virtual Ath event, which will be this Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Feng Yu Wu will discuss happiness and economics. Thank you all and have a great evening.